Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and I'm here today with my colleague and very dear friend, Dr. Lee O'Brien. Hi Lee.
Hi Stephanie.
And so I have invited Lee here today to talk to me about a book that we both love and we love talking about, and that is Jane Austen's Emma. So Lee,
Yes.
Emma as a character rather than as a novel is sometimes a little bit controversial because a lot of people think that she's not quite as lovable as other Austen heroines. She's a bit know-it-all. She's a bit bossy. What do you think of Emma?
What do I think of Emma? I've been reading the novel ready for this podcast and thinking about it. And one thing that struck me, she actually isn't very nice. and the thing that struck me this time around, because I think her father is such a problematic character, how alike they are, because he can never see that other people would differ from him.
Yes.
They want their basin of gruel and they can't eat fruit because he can't eat rich food, nobody else can. And it's made so clear, and Emma actually sees this herself, that she saw Mr. Elton through the lens of what she wanted him to be, which is the partner marriage option for Harriet Smith. And I thought, yes, there's that similarity between Emma and her father, and I think the father is a really nasty character. I don't know what other people think of him, but so yes, and yet there's something really likable about her, and to me that comes down to the real magic of this novel, is that really the characters do live. You get this vivid sense of the reality of the people, and only the greatest writers can do that, because she does it very economically.
She does. I think that's a really perceptive comment about her father and her. I don't think I'd kind of thought about that in any great depth, but you're right. There is a kind of self-centeredness, a selfishness about both characters that comes through in their actions. I really like Emma. I agree that she's not, sympathetic in ways that other, like Elizabeth Bennet is. And I think she is quite nasty. Obviously, she is quite nasty and she does many, many wrong things. But what I love about her is just how bossy she is.
Yes.
I love that. I just don't think and I do a lot of work on the 18th century novel, and you just get such kind of milquetoast heroines who are just lovely and do the right thing all the time and have no flaws and are paragons of virtue. And I think it's actually quite bold in ways that we perhaps don't appreciate today, that she just goes for it.
Yes. And it's interesting that she really uses her social privilege shamelessly.
Yeah.
And in a way that men do without even thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think there's a really interesting passage where she's so offended that Mr. Elton had even thought that they could marry. And it's focalized. We were talking about the narration, and it's focalized through Emma and her sense of outrage that he would be so aware that Harriet wasn't good enough for him, but not aware at all that he's not good enough for Emma. And so I think it's interesting that the novel starts with her and her father together. They are the kind of icons of privilege in their area and power and upper class power. And I like what you're saying, because in spite of the fact that she's bossy, and she nearly ruins poor Harriet's life by making her say no to the first marriage proposal from
Robert Martin.
Yes. Yeah. But I like her too. She has a confidence, and I think that's placed really nicely against Mr. Knightley, who is a lot older. He's 38, she's not quite 21. So he's 37, 38. So there's a huge age gap, which is much more, it's quite problematic, perhaps more problematic for us than it was back then. But I don't know if that's true. I think the age gap is always an issue. But there's that constant dueling between them about their authority and about their way of reading the world around them. And she stands up to him. I like that. She's not milquetoast, as you say. She's not fainting all over the place. And and some of the insights you get into her, I remember when we see her first going and visiting the Bateses, and she does it as a duty, and as soon as you start hearing Miss Bates's conversation, you realise, if you were actually sitting through that, it would be driving you crazy, just as it drives Emma up the wall.
Isn't Austen good at that? Like, just giving you this monologue from Miss Bates, and you think, I know people like that.
Yes, that's right.
And you think, what a great observer Austen was to capture somebody like that.
And to capture Emma's real fed upness with it. I mean, she can't be rude. So she has this kind of noblesse oblige things that she has to go through. But there's no way that she's thinking to herself, "Oh, these are the salt of the earth battlers," or whatever.
Yeah,
she's
that's
thinking,
right.
"Oh dear God, do I have to go and see them again?" And they keep ramming Jane Fairfax down her throat.
And of course, you'd react like that.
The first visit, she thinks, "At least I'll be safe from a letter from Jane Fairfax." But of course, Jane Fairfax has actually written a letter, and she can't even get away. So there's things that make you think, "Oh God, she's bossy, and God, she's this," but then you think she's just right on. She actually reads her surroundings and the people she has to live with in a really accurate way, although she can misread them disastrously.
Well, I mean, there's a depth of psychological realism there, because that is exactly how you would react. The way she reacts to Jane Fairfax is exactly the way you would react to having this, oh, she's so wonderful, she's excellent at everything, she's talented, genius, beautiful, etc. If you had to sit there and hear all about this perfection, picture perfection, you would get annoyed too. And Austen doesn't shy away from that, whereas I feel like most other kind of 18th century novelists would present that in a kind of non-problematic way. She's perfect. Oh, we should be inspired by her. Whereas Jane Austen goes, oh, God, people who are supposed to be inspiring are just the worst. And they're so annoying.
Yes.
So she really goes there with the sort of psychological realism.
I think she does too. And there's so many interesting things too, because I think it's interesting that Emma understands, she sees Harriet's prettiness and her sexual desirability. And therefore, and she reads Elton, because he's a man on the make, and he's and she reads partly she understands the kind of man he is. But I thought it was interesting that Emma would understand, and we were given to understand. All this is so implicit and oblique. But she understands that a man can fall in love with a woman because he's lust. He desires her, and she's thinking that she can manipulate that to Harriet's advantage, and so Harriet can marry up. But of course, Harriet is the natural daughter of somebody.
Yeah, which means illegitimate. Yeah,
and we find out, as Mr Knightley knows right from the get-go, that a man like Elton is just not even going to consider her. He might have an affair with her or use her, and then
trifle with her.
Yeah, that's a nice 18th century.
I've read a lot of 18th century novels.
Yes, he might trifle with her, but there's no way he would marry her.
Yeah, that's right.
Emma, it's interesting that Emma reads the sex bit of it quite accurately, that Harriet's sexually attractive in this sort of blonde, sort of almost Marilyn Monroe its way. But she strikingly misreads the class politics of it.
Which is interesting because she's so attuned to class in every other way. She's so conscious of her class position, but yet she misreads the class politics of that. I don't know, whenever I reread Emma, it strikes me how isolated she is. I think she's incredibly lonely. She's got nobody around her that is of her level, which is why I think the relationship with Mr Knightley becomes so important, because he's really the only person who's on her level socially and on her level intellectually. And so you can understand why she sort of latches on to Harriet Smith, even though Harriet is of a different social class and isn't the brightest tool in the shed. She's just got her father, who is this terrible kind of selfish monster who expects her to kind of give up everything about her life. I mean, even at the end when she marries Knightley, she can't go and live in Donwell Abbey. She has to stay home and take care of him still. So she's strikingly lonely to me. And you can understand, like, in that environment where you've got nobody kind of, you know, similar age, similar kind of intelligence, similar interests around you, that you would go a bit stir crazy and start meddling with people.
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was rereading it just recently, because I've read it so many times and it's such a rich novel and I keep seeing different things in it. But that's exactly what I was thinking. She's very lonely, and when her governess goes, when Miss Taylor becomes
Mrs. Weston,
Mrs. Weston,
yeah,
she's desperate. And she's got these dreadful evenings with her father.
Yeah, can you imagine?
All he does is natter on about well, we're missing Miss Taylor, and poor Miss Taylor, and she has to hear the same things from him over and over and over again. So we've got this immense social privilege and wealth combined with real deprivation.
Well, she's bored, I think.
She's bored to death.
Yeah, and I mean, wouldn't you be bored if you had to sit there and listen to your father talk about, oh, isn't it a shame that this woman got married? And also, I'm feeling really ill all the time.
I think that's registered. The light's too low, but I can't find the bit that I was thinking. But I love John Knightley, Mr. He's the younger son.
Yeah.
So he doesn't inherit Donwell Abbey and all the stuff that goes with that. So he's a lawyer, so he's out there he's working. You know, he's a working man. And there's this when they go, he's come to visit Emma and her father, and they go to Randall's. They're invited to Randall's on the snowy evening.
Yeah.
And he's just so annoyed, and he says, we have to travel for hours to meet people that we've met before. We're going to hear the same things said that we heard yesterday, and they weren't interesting then. So here we are. You know, we all want to be at home, and we have to go out. We have to socialise. And he just pinpoints the utter sterility of it.
Yeah.
Being with people that you have nothing in common with, who haven't got an interesting thought in their heads. And you're with them because they're people like us. They can't go out with the farmers and whatever, and working people who might have something interesting to say. And he talks about that thing that you're picking up on, that real isolation and the boredom that comes with it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's picked up on when Emma says she hasn't been to the sea. Now, this is in Kent, so the sea's not that far away, right? So she hasn't really left this village that she lives in. And it's the only, people make a lot of this flippant comment that Austen makes to her niece, who is thinking of starting to write books. And she says 3 or 4 families in a country village, that's the very thing to write about. And people make a lot of that as you know, signalling that she's got kind of small ambition for her novels. I think she's being tongue-in-cheek there, because this is actually the only book that is about 3 or 4 families in a country village. And she goes to some length to show how kind of dull and limiting and awful it is when you're just stuck in this village. And I mean, Emma's got lots of money, she's got lots of wealth, she's got lots of privilege. Those are all things that are good in that make her comfortable. They mean that she's secure, but she's bored. She's got nobody around her. She's never seen anything or done anything. She's just been her father's kind of nursemaid. It's not a great portrait of life in a very narrowly...
No, it's not at all. I think you're right. And it's interesting too, it's partly gendered, because the males would have... They'd have hunting.
Yeah.
And cockfighting and bear and bull baiting and all that really...
And Mr Knightley can go
stuff.
off.
And they can go off.
Yeah.
And they can do the late 19th century version of slumming. They can go and carouse with all kinds of strange people linked to that rather loose world of gambling and gaming and whoring and whatever. But for the women who could do nothing of that, it really must have been a prison. It must have been awful. And I think you're right, she really captures how someone... Because I think we like she's attractive because she's indisputably intelligent.
Yeah, she is.
And so that all that intelligence is wasted,
Well, she's put it to like really bad uses.
Yes, she
which
becomes
is
manipulative.
Yeah, and she's just running people's lives for them because she thinks she knows better.
Yeah.
But you can see how somebody in her situation would do that.
Yes.
And there's this kind of wasted intelligence about her.
There is. I think that sense of waste, and so that, getting back to your initial point about Emma herself, I think all those things make her a very sympathetic character. You can see what she is, but you can see why she has become what she is.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's brilliant. I just, it's so clever the way it's all done.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to get back to that point too that you made about the age difference between her and Mr Knightley.
Yes.
Because that's something that's a bit kind of, I don't know, problematic and weird about it, that he remembers her as a baby.
He does. He actually says that to her at one point, doesn't he? He said, something about you, I was 16-year-old. She says, well, why should you know better than I do? And he says, I was 16 years old when you were born. Yeah,
and I remember like holding you as a baby, and now I'm into you, which is weird.
Yes.
Do you think that's an us thing, or do you like a 21st century reading, or do you think that's something that Austen is aware of?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure. Because on the one hand, she keeps emphasising the age difference between them. It's part of the fabric of the narrative. We know that he's a lot older.
And they keep mentioning it.
Yes, and so he has this kind of much older brother. Almost sometimes it's not a fatherly relationship, because he is so clearly in love with her right from the beginning, and that's very subtly indicated. But when she's talking about Mr. Elton and he's getting so angry, and she has no idea why he's angry, but he can see that Elton wants her and he wants her, and so there's all that. So I just don't know, because it was so common, wasn't it, for much older men to marry young women, especially if they were heiresses.
That's right.
There's that whole marriage market aspect of it. And of course, the younger the women were, the more enticing they were. And I think we're no different now. I mean, how many famous men are in public life with partners 10, 15, 20 years younger than they are? It's still, it's a male privilege, because when women do that, all hell breaks loose, and they're
shock
mad and they're stupid and they're whatever. But we still, I think, I'm actually wondering if the attitudes are not pretty much the same then and now. That it's acknowledged as a part of life, but a lot of people are very uncomfortable with it.
Well, I think the fact that Austen keeps trying to have to manage it is an indication of something. Because remember, there's that scene where he says, Emma is talking about dancing with Mr. Knightley, and she says, we're not so much brother and sister as to make it improper. And he says, brother and sister, no, indeed. So there's this whole kind of acknowledgement of their kind of weird familial relationship to each other, as well as that kind of older brother, younger sister vibe that they seem to have, at least on one kind of reading. There's this acknowledgement that is perhaps a problem, and Austen has to bat these problems away to make it work.
Yeah, I think so too. And one thing, Knightley, do you think this? Knightley is aware of it all the way through the novel. Yeah, right from the beginning, he knows that he's in love with her. He desires her, and she doesn't. And so we just accept that as a narrative, given that as intelligent as Emma is, it has never entered her head that Knightley might be in love with her. So we have to accept that. And that's a bit of a big ask, actually, when you think about it. But I think Austen makes that believable. It is part of Emma's blindness, I think, and part of, she's been caught up with Miss Taylor, and her father dominates her life. So you can sort of understand it. But I think the whole issue of him being a lot older, it's something that she can't acknowledge. Are we to think that he has never had any liaison? He's 38, which back then was considered to be kind of well into middle age. We've got such a different vision of ages now.
Yeah.
But he's not a young man anymore. And it's a place Austen doesn't go, because what kind of man is he? Has he had affairs on the quiet? I don't think we're supposed to think that he does. Are we supposed to think he's a male virgin? I don't know.
Well,
what are we supposed to think about a 38-year-old, very intelligent, active man? What? So that's not part of the narrative at all. So,
we tend to read Emma as very young now, but she's nearly 21.
Yes,
which is not necessarily as young as it sounds. Like, to me, that sounds like she's barely out of the cradle. But for the time, she's getting to be a little bit older, to be unmarried, and everybody makes such an issue of her not being married or not being interested in marriage. Don't you want to get married? Isn't it time you started thinking about marriage? Why are you not thinking about marriage? It's confusing to everybody that she's kind of absented herself from that kind of marriage market. So there is something interesting going on there as well. I mean, I don't know. I think that in some ways Mr Knightley is presented, in kind of obvious ways as like the perfect English squire. Even his, Donwell Abbey, done well, It's like, it's not kind of subtle, and he's, he's always got like strawberries and apples and, like the great English kind of beneficent farmer kind of figure. But yeah, it is a bit problematic. I don't think we can get away from that kind of power dynamic, and the fact that he's always lecturing her and telling her what to do. And I mean, she gives it back to him, but he is very
he's a bit paternal, isn't he?
He's very paternal, in his relationship to her.
See, we've spoken about our mutual fascination of Georgette Hyde before, but it's not until you get to the 20th century that Hire can actually address, well, you've got these men who are in their late 30s. They had to have had a past of some kind, and she factors that into her plots quite overtly. All the marvellous, fascinating heroes. They've usually, the bits of muslin, what do they call them, and the barks of frailty. They've had liaisons. They haven't been in a monastery until they're in their late 30s. But it's a sign of, obviously, the times that Austen is writing in, and she just is not going to go there. But as a modern reader, because it's clear that Mr Knightley is he's worldly. He's got a lot of experience. Yeah,
he's got he's set up as a lot of having a lot of wisdom, I suppose.
Yes, and he's not a fool, and he hasn't lived a sequestered life. So we sort of there's a lot of bits and pieces of it that you.
Yeah, well, actually, I was talking about this with some other people about Georgette Hire, and it occurred to me as I was speaking that Georgette Hire has the advantage that Jane Austen doesn't have, which is showing men in a men-only environment, which Austen can't do at any level, right? So even if she has a conversation between two men, it has to be a conversation between two men in like a drawing room. That's right. And there's not many of them, I don't think. I haven't this is just off the top of my head, I haven't done like a count of how many male conversations are in Austen novels, but there are almost none, it strikes me. At least not in like male-only spaces. Like, she can't go into the men's clubs. She can't go into what they say to each other when they're hunting. She can't show them visiting brothels. Okay, so we don't get to see what the world looks like for men at this time. We very much know what it looks like for women, but she can't write about male interactions.
That's really interesting. Now I'm going to have to go back and look at all the novels, because I think you're right. There's very few male interactions without women very close or without it being in a domestic
space, where women could enter at any time.
Yes, exactly. But it is registered and it's registered through the Mr. Elton character, who's a total swine.
Yeah.
But remember Knightley, he says gently to Emma when they're talking about Harriet Smith, and he says, well, I've heard
that's right.
I've heard the way he talks when he's with men only. And he's not the kind of man who's going to throw his life away on a natural daughter of somebody.
Yeah.
He's very ambitious. And you just get a couple of fleeting glimpses. John Knightley says something too about Mr. Elton being a fool when he's with women because he's playing the lover and trying to attract them and all the rest of it. And he says at one point he can actually be quite rational and all right, commonsensical when he's with men. So that's a really interesting. We'll never know. I mean, just how much Austen could have indirectly observed of this male, what men were really like.
Well, she had a lot of brothers, so I'm sure she knew.
Yeah. Yes. See, that comes out in New Woman fiction too. I think it's in a Modern Woman. One of the characters says, and this is in the 1890s, women just don't know what men are really like. Because of that separate spheres, male behaviour, female behaviour, and all that weight of masculine and feminine stereotypes and how people must behave in order to be accepted as legitimate members of this hierarchical society. And so even in the 1890s, you can't have any guarantee that young women would have any idea. But we know about them in the novels. There's no way of actually knowing, is there? Because with brothers, there's a lot of hints that you get that women could actually see more and know more.
Yeah, that's right.
Than they could ever say.
Yeah, and I think you get that sense that you're right, that conversation that Knightley has about Elton and knowing what sort of man he is very interesting, I think. Yes,
he's a completely different man when he's with other men, and that is registered in the novel. But you're right, it's never shown. That's a fascinating thing. It's never shown, and I don't know whether Austen got caught up. It's not for ladies to know. What
and certainly not for ladies to write
about.
Yeah,
because that just brings the whole fiction of the gentleman crashing to the ground.
Yeah,
because they were sexually active and they were doing all kinds of things with the total freedom that they had, and you can't maintain that fiction of nobility if you actually see the dark side.
Well, I mean, she kind of does that with Elton anyway, because he's a clergyman. He's supposed to be the kind of moral exemplar of the community, and here we have a dude who is clearly angling for the richest bride he can get, who clearly has sexual desires and acts upon them, or tries to act upon them, who is his on the make, as you said, who is ambitious, who is going to try and get himself in, shore up his own position, shore up his wealth, shore up his, privilege. He's not acting as a kind of Christian exemplar at all. And then he goes and gets this terrible wife who is just one of Austen's most brilliant comic creations, because she's so terrible. But it's interesting that she's coded as having something to do with slavery.
Oh, is she?
And the slave trade. Yes, because she comes from Bristol, which is a huge slave port.
Oh.
So, and then remember there's that comment about how she says, if you mean that as a fling against the slave trade, Mr. Suckling, you know how she's connected to this family of Sucklings? Their Sucklings aren't involved in the slave trade, or whatever she says, I can't remember. But she makes a comment about the slave trade, and she's from Bristol. So she's coded as being implicated, certainly, even if not directly implicated,
that's fascinating.
In the slave trade. So I think that's interesting too. There's always politics in Austen. It's just not, she doesn't use a megaphone to say, hey, I'm being political, but it's there.
And we've lost the capacity to read, to understand the really fine social cultural observations that are part of the narrative fabric. It's our ignorance.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we see Bristol and we just think of the city. We don't necessarily think. But I've remembered where that kind of comes from. That comes from remember Jane Fairfax talks about governessing as the sale of human intellect, and how it's comparable to the sale of human flesh, which is obviously the slave trade. And then she says, if you mean that as a fling against the slave trade, I can assure you that Mr. Suckling isn't, or he got out of the slave trade, or whatever she says. So there is a real kind of reference, a clear kind of parallel drawn up
so
here.
All these dark things is kind of weaving around and to a certain extent within the narrative, if you know, as you've just said, how to read the codes of it.
Yeah.
But yes, I think Elton, and one of my favourite scenes in the novel, remember when he proposes to her, and by John Knightley's forgotten which carriage he's supposed to be in, and he gets in with the carriage with his wife, so that this leaves Emma and Mr Elton alone.
Oh yeah, that's right, because John Knightley's very worried about being out in the snow.
He's had a few drinks. And he's a little bit, hyper. And so he thinks that she's just ready to fall into his arms. And there's this comedy of errors that unfolds within this very restricted space. And Emma is appalled. And then when he realises the extent of his mistaken reading of everything, he's appalled. And there's this lovely comment at the end that they get to the point where they just can't say anything. And they're both so angry that they're not even embarrassed.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, what does she call all the little zigzags of embarrassment? They're just furious.
They're just furious.
And they just want to get out of the carriage. And so there's this moment of this real, it's not within the polite discourse. It's this real clash of different interests and wills and...
Yeah. And if you think about, like, the carriage and how enclosed that is, they're, like, right next to each other. They, by this time, they're hating each other and, really, angry. But I love the way she says that. Austen uses a line, which is so easy to misinterpret now. Mr. Elton was actually making violent love to her. You're like, what? You realise that doesn't really have the connotations.
No, not quite. But you're told that he's slightly inebriated, so...
Yeah. So he's probably a bit handsy.
He's probably, yes. So again, none of it's spelled out. You have to sort of put it all together. I mean, he's not, he's not really touching her or anything, but there's this whole atmosphere in the... I just think I love that.
I know, she's so great at those kind of like...
Yes.
I mean, it's not comic in a way, but it also is comic.
Oh, yes. And the fury. And they, for once, they actually see each other, how they are.
Yeah.
And they don't have any of the polite flim-flam to cushion it all. It's just bang, they realise what it's like. And they just cannot get away from each other quickly enough. And
that's a good point, because... it's so rare that men and women can talk honestly with each other at this time. And so when they do, out of, some kind of moment of emotional upheaval, whatever it is, and they can kind of be honest, it's noteworthy. It's a big thing, because usually there's such, as you say, layers of polite flim-flam that you have to kind of go through. Yeah. And that prevents you from seeing.
Yes, it sort of cushions everything, and the politeness just disables all that fury. But this, in the carriage, it couldn't. Yeah. So I just love that. But yeah, I think he's a really nasty piece of work.
He deserves his nasty wife.
Oh, he does. He does.
They can be nasty together forever.
Forever, yes. Love, honour and be nasty together.
Yeah, they're the caro sposo.
Until death do them part.
Yeah. Oh, they're so terrible.
Now we haven't spoken about Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill. Now tell me the whole setup about Frank Churchill. It's some, I don't know if it still happens these days, but it's this child who's sort of given to another family.
Yeah. Just very odd, isn't it?
Like a little parcel,
Yeah.
Oh, we don't have children. You've got a child, you don't really want to be bothered with. How about just giving him to us? So,
yeah.
I mean,
it's a bit odd. Like, I mean, Jane Austen's brother had that happen to him too. Like, they had rich relatives who didn't have any children, and the Austens had, I can't remember how many children. It probably makes me a hugely bad Austen scholar, but I can't remember how many children there were in the family. But there were a lot. And so they gave him to this other family, and he took on the last name of Knight because he joined the Knight family, and he inherited a lot of wealth and property because of it. Lucky for him. Odd. Yeah. If, in our kind of contemporary terms and our way of thinking about the family, it's odd that the parents would sort of give up their child. But I suppose if you had a lot of them and you didn't, and there was only so much money.
That happens with Fanny Price too, doesn't it?
Yeah, because she goes to Mansfield Park. Yeah.
And there's an economic driver of
Yeah,
it.
that's right.
It's not they've seen the little boy, oh, we love him, he's lovely, can we have him?
They need an heir.
They need an heir, and it's all driven by economics, which I think Austen registers really brilliantly.
Yeah.
But we've talked about Emma being a problematic but a very sympathetic character, and I still, as much as I've got problems with Mr Knightley, I think he's one of her nicest.
Yeah, I agree. He's a lovely character.
I like him. I like it when he's very, he can be a bit of a pain, but he's very commonsensical. Remember when they were all worried about the snow?
Yeah.
And he's the one who actually goes out and checks
the snow, yeah.
So we've talked about him, and I like his brother, who's a little bit too blunt for comfort.
But he's talking sense. Like, it is really annoying to go out on a cold evening when you could just sit at home. I agree completely.
And there's some interesting things about their marriage. We may not have time to get onto that. But anyway, now, so we've got, but what about, so the other main characters are Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. So what's your reading of Frank?
Well, I don't know. I think you can, it depends kind of how you read him and whether you pick up the signs about what's actually going on with Jane. I think he's really problematic in that what he's asked Jane to do, which is to keep a secret engagement, and an engagement contracted at a watering hole, is quite kind of sexually suspect for the time. And he's put her in a very compromising position, and she's very emotionally kind of worn out by it. And you can see that in that great scene where they're obviously talking about each other when they're on that trip to Domel Abbey, and they're obviously having fights that are happening off script, off page, and that are coming out in the way they relate to each other. And she sort of runs off and so forth. He's put a lot of emotional strain on her. He's behaved badly to Emma, knowingly, really badly to Emma. And I mean, he thinks that they're both playing the flirtation game, which they are, but he also doesn't know how much Emma is actually engaging in this emotionally. So I think he's quite not nice, really. I mean, he's quite, the way he behaves is quite awful to both Emma and to Jane in asking her to keep this secret and this lie that could, really damage her reputation. And I mean, it turns out kind of all right for him at the end, but he's the kind of character that, like, he'll always kind of fall backwards into being okay, but he doesn't really deserve to be okay.
Yeah, I agree. I find him really sort of quite obnoxious, and I think although it's clear that he's very good looking.
Yeah, and he's very charming.
Yes, and charming, and very sexually attractive. So we've got that, as Mr. Elton is in his own way. So we've got these different versions of male attractiveness. So, but I think it's set up really nicely in the novel where they keep expecting him to come and visit them because he owes his father a visit because his father has married.
It's very rude of him.
Remarried.
Yeah.
And there's that lovely registering of, their hopes and expectations that he would come, and they have to keep blaming his adoptive parents and
Mrs. Churchill,
their whims and fancies and their nastiness. But Mr. Knightley knows that it's Frank Churchill. It's Frank who can't be bothered to come back and visit his father because it's not in his financial interest. The father can do nothing for him.
And it's probably dull to go hang out in the country rather than...
We know, actually.
We know it's dull.
It's dull. So he's not going to be caught dead coming back and visiting.
And the only reason he comes back is because Jane's there.
Because Jane is there. And that's crystal clear in the novel.
He's selfish.
He's selfish. He only turns up to follow Jane. So, and in some ways you can understand him not making a big deal of a relationship. That's fine with his father and all the rest of it. And his father must have been happy, was clearly happy to give him up. So there's ways in which you can see that he's a perfectly rational creature, not necessarily malicious. But I don't know. I see aspects of malice. He seems right on the edge of the character of the rake to me, and the sexually licentious and dangerous male. And I don't know how you feel about the end of the novel, but I do worry about Jane Fairfax.
Yeah, well, I mean, Emma has that comment, or I can't remember if it's Emma or Mr. Knightley, about when they're thinking about Jane and Frank and their relationship, they say something like, doesn't it underline to you the importance of truth and honesty in our dealings with each other? Because, I mean, when you think about it, like, Frank's encouraged Emma to speculate about Jane having an affair with her best friend's husband.
Yeah.
Knowing full well, I mean, that's to deflect attention from what's going on with them, but it's not a nice position for him to put his intended fiancée, his intended wife, in, you know, that I'm going to encourage speculation that she's had an adulterous liaison, or that if not adulterous, that he was in love with her and married the friend because he had to, kind of thing. So that's not very nice. No. And he has trifled with Emma. He has put Jane in an unfortunate position. I think it's kind of interesting, and I'll never kind of have this experience again. And I can't remember what it was like to read the book for the first time. Do you pick up on what's actually happening? Because you can pick up on what's actually happening with Jane and Frank, I think. I think there are certainly enough clues in there that a really astute reader is going to pick up on it. But I think it's also possible to be completely surprised by it.
I wonder. I can't remember.
And I can't remember. I read this way too young to remember.
Me too. No, I can't remember either.
Yeah. I just wonder how that might feed into it, because I just don't remember a reading experience when I didn't know that this was going on.
And just listening to you talk too, it seems to me there's two possibilities for Emma herself, because we both feel there's a nice Emma and an Emma, well, you know, nice and an Emma that we really appreciate and that has her good qualities, and then there's the malicious Emma, who when she first hears, when she's visiting the Bates and she hears she's got this letter thrust at her again, and she thinks, aha. She's the one who comes up with the idea that Jane has had this scandalous,
and then Frank,
and there's a real malice in that. So, and you're sort of caught in as a reader, because you can partly understand. Well, she's had this woman rammed down her throat as a paragon of perfection, and she suddenly thinks, aha, know, it's only human that she would be a bit.
I'm going to find the flaw here. Nobody this perfect exists. Yeah.
But there's a malice in it, and I think there's also a malice in the way she manipulates poor old Harriet. Because if Jane Fairfax is vulnerable, Harriet Smith, as an illegitimate daughter, and a pretty one at that, is incredibly vulnerable.
Completely. She's got nobody to protect her.
No. She could be utterly chewed up and destroyed. So Emma, there's that kind of malice in Emma that you can actually see replicated in Frank Churchill.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because they're the two children of privilege, aren't they?
Yes, they are. So you can see where Emma is it like the in Pride and Prejudice, the Mr. Darcy Wickham, the good hero and the bad hero. It's never an option in the novel, or partly it is if Emma and Frank were ever to come together. And I think the novel is setting us up to see, well, that would just make Emma all the bad things that she is.
Yeah.
But Mr. Knightley is going to bring out the good Emma.
That's a really interesting point, because I'm remembering there's a television adaptation. I think it's the Romola Garai Emma, which was done like 10 years ago maybe, with Romola Garai as Emma. And the way that adaptation starts, I didn't think it was a particularly successful adaptation, but I really like the start, which is they show Frank going off to be part of the Churchill family, which is something obviously you don't get narrated in the book. It's already happened in the book. But you start off with Emma as a child losing her mother, and Frank going off to be part of the Churchill family. And so you get this kind of very explicit parallel drawn up between Emma and Frank.
Oh, how interesting.
As kind of motherless children who have, and he's obviously gone away to be rich and she's at home and rich. So, you know, like they have things to, you know, help them through their sufferings, which is piles of money. But there is an interesting kind of parallel drawn there that I hadn't kind of thought about before I saw that adaptation, that they're both motherless.
Yes.
And they're both in these situations that they've been thrust into that they have to manage, and they both become selfish, and they've both become kind of too caught up in their own kind of privilege. But where Frank seems to be much more kind of actively malicious. I agree Emma has a streak of maliciousness to her, but Emma seems to have retained a kind of goodness and intelligence about her, whereas Frank only acts for himself, for his own self-interest.
Yes. It's that thing that happens in a lot of romance novels. I don't know if it's right to characterise Emma as a romance novel, probably not. But anyway, that kind of shadow possibilities. The heroine is given a number of choices, and you can see that she's going to be not only live a completely different life, but be a different person depending on who she aligns her life with. Because marriage in that time, I mean, it's a very serious thing. It's like walking into a prison, and you
can't get out.
You can't get out.
You think twice. Too bad.
You really are tied to this person forever.
Well, there's a number of options for Emma, isn't there? There's the Frank option, which is a bad option.
Yeah.
Although she kind of flirts with it at the beginning, but then decides, no, I'm not into that. And then there's the single option.
Yes.
But I mean, is the single option good? Because the only single woman is Miss Bates.
Miss Bates.
You don't want to end up like Miss Bates.
No.
And I mean, she's got the money that Miss Bates doesn't, but Miss Bates has also fallen in the world because the father has died. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that
that's where Emma could end up.
She could end up as Miss Bates. Remember, Jane Austen is a single woman living with her mother.
Yes, she is.
So there's another kind of
I'd never thought of that.
Parallel.
And Emma, if the worst happened, would be left with looking after her father as Miss Bates is looking after her.
And can you imagine? She's already bored. She's only 21. Give her another 20 years of living with this guy talking about gruel all the time. You may well end up as Miss Bates.
Did we know where the money comes from for Hartfield? There's that lovely description of it as a little notch in the Donwell Abbey estate.
Yeah.
And Donwell
is much bigger.
It's much bigger, and
it's an abbey.
And it owns the village.
Yeah.
What's it called?
Highfield.
Highfield, yes. So it's
not
clear.
Highfield. Yeah, Hartfield is her estate.
Yes. So it's
Highbury,
that's it. And Donwell Abbey, I think it owns the village. It's part of its domain.
Well, it's an old abbey that's been with the dissolution of the monastery, so it's huge.
It's huge
and controls.
So you can see where the money comes, and there's the emphasis on the farming, and so it's because Mr Knightley is partly a working farmer. There's some
he manages
it. Yes, he's probably not getting.
He's not like digging up potatoes.
Or whatever. But he's very much. Involved in the running of the
he's
estate.
Active. Yeah,
so you can see where the money is coming from. I can't with Hartfield. I don't know where their money is coming from.
I think it's just inherited wealth.
Yeah, it has to have.
But just
what? Not the investments in what? Investments in companies.
Investments in land.
Yeah,
it's just an old. Yeah.
But just what I was trying to think through is your point that they may come a cropper. Because if it's investments can go wrong. They use that in Downton Abbey. The Abbey is under threat if they don't modernise, and Lord Grantham nearly loses everything because he invests in the wrong railway.
And he needs an American to marry to bring the money.
That's right. So it's a perpetual problem, although Hartfield isn't like either of the Abbeys. So I'm just thinking of what you're saying, that how I think the novel allows us to believe that Emma and her father are fine. They're never going to be subject to financial catastrophe. But I think you're right. It's not an impossibility, and it's certainly not an impossibility in Jane Austen's world. I mean, the South Sea bubble and all these things.
Well, it's exactly what, as you were talking, it just occurred to me, which is something I've never kind of thought through to any great length before. But what happens to Miss Bates is exactly what happened to Jane Austen, which is her father. Miss Bates's father has obviously died because there's only the mother and her. And they're now living in very straitened circumstances, and that's exactly what happened to the Austen family, because the father died. He was the village curate, or the village parson rather, and they live in straitened circumstances and depend upon the kindness of the rich brother in order to live at this point. So at this point, she's writing at Chawton House, which is a really small house on the land of her brother, which they can only live in because her brother has inherited this huge estate, which is the smaller estate of the two estates, or whatever, how many estates he inherited. So they're dependent on the kindness, in inverted commas, of the brother for a house to live in. So they're in straitened circumstances too. So there's an interesting parallel between Miss Bates and Miss Austen.
And there's that famous sequence where she describes Miss Bates and how she doesn't have, how vulnerable she is to the nastiness of people. It's a famous sequence. I can't think of. Well,
Mr Knightley talks about that when he's chastising Emma,
and she uses that famous phrase, which I'm going to mangle, but she has nothing to frighten people into civility towards her.
Yeah, she doesn't have money.
It's quite early in the novel, and it's hard. I think you're right. It's hard not to believe that that's coming from Jane Austen's own experience of what it's like to have to be talked to people speaking to you as if you're a non-entity. And because I get the impression that she was a very private person, and she wasn't going around, saying, I'm Jane Austen, I'm writing these novels, and she wasn't advertising that the sharpest of sharp intelligences that she had. Can you imagine the kind of social situation she herself would have been caught up in?
Well, I get the sense from her family that her and her sister were very much the poor relations, that it was convenient to, especially for her richer brother, who had, 11 children or something ridiculous, that it was very convenient to call upon Jane and Cassandra to come and stay with them and help them out when another lying in was occurring and all of this sort of stuff. And
because they had nothing better to do.
They had nothing better to do, and Jane did earn some money off her writing, not a staggering amount, but she did earn some independent income. But she was very dependent on other people. And I think that there's an interesting portrait there in Miss Bates. Obviously, I think Miss Bates and Austen are very different characters, but you can see that in that kind of sensitive awareness of how awful Miss Bates' situation is.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, that there's a real kind of, a real knowledge of what life is like as a single woman.
And Miss Bates trades in words too.
Yeah.
Miss Bates is always
so she's talking. Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think there are some very interesting parallels and that kind of inside knowledge. And she's so hurt by Emma's comment
about how dull she is.
Yes. You will of course be confined to one dull statement. And Mr Knightley's furious with Emma, and it's a real spark of just the poor woman can't fight back, and by that time we know all the power hierarchies, and it's a wonderfully revealing moment in the novel that Emma can never make good, because Miss Bates, you see that Miss Bates can never really trust her again.
Yeah, that there's always a kind of strangeness to their relationship.
She tries to sort of grovel and go back, but she can't take that comment back. So I think that's I just think that as you say, that observation of the vulnerable woman and the unmarried. Yeah, because God knows you can get into trouble being married to the wrong man, but being a single woman, unless you're like Lady Catherine de Bourgh or whatever.
But she's a widow, so that's different.
She's different, and she's got money. Money changes everything. Yeah. But single women didn't have money. Unless they were able to inherit, and obviously Austen couldn't.
And, another parallel between Emma and Miss Bates that just occurred to me as you were talking is that Miss Bates has Mrs. Bates to kind of deal with.
She does.
The deaf woman who's always going, what? I can't hear you, speak up, So she's got this sick or, infirm mother, and Emma's got this hypochondriac, not really infirm, but believes himself to be infirm father. Yes, so there's a nice kind of parallel, perhaps this is an alternative universe, Emma. And so therefore when Mr Knightley comes calling back and, it's a really great option for her. Well, it is a great option for her. He's they're well suited and he's lovely and they're going to shore up their kind of joint power.
That's right. And I think we are to understand that Emma realises that she's always loved him, that she hasn't known herself. It's one of those novels of coming to where the heroine comes to understand her own ignorance of her own desires and her own self.
Yeah, that's the one person she hasn't been able to read is herself.
Yes, exactly.
I love that. And that's a kind of famous moment in like Austen novels, the realization shot through her like an arrow that Mr Knightley must marry nobody but herself.
That's
and
right.
I mean that's famous to read. And it's such a I teach this with my students who I hope are listening to this about like that moment in as a kind of example of free and direct discourse, like who is talking, who is is it the narrator or her, and it's such a beautiful moment of using free and direct discourse in its kind of most powerful manifestation, so that you're in Emma's head, but you're also being spoken to by a narrator. So there's that real blurring.
And you're in Emma's body.
Yeah.
It's that bodily awakening.
It's like it's shot through her like an arrow. That moment of revelation. Yeah.
Have we got time to talk about Jane Fairfax?
We have 1 minute to talk about Jane Fairfax.
Yes. Tell me, Jane Fairfax. Is it just me, or are we to read her as quite sexually aware?
I think we are.
Yeah.
I think she always seemed that way to me. Maybe it's because she's contracted this kind of bit of a dubious relationship with Frank.
And that would make it much harder for her to deal with the hypocrisy of people around her.
Yeah.
If she's actually that's the interesting contrast with Emma. If Jane Fairfax is actually aware of her desires in a way that Emma is not.
And Jane is always aware of what's actually going on.
Yes, very much so, isn't she? She strikes me as a really modern heroine. Is that a stupid thing to say?
No, I don't think so. I think she's very knowing and and like even in that vision of her as that kind of alternative, we've been talking about like alternative roads. She could have been the governess, and that almost seems to like look forward to like the governess fictions of the 19th century. Because
you can see down the track Charlotte Bronte playing with that idea with Jane Eyre.
Exactly.
Who is knowing, but she's not licentious, or she's not, she's perfectly, nice person, but she knows things, she's aware of what's going on. Her power, her character, it's not driven by innocence that is really ignorance. They're very knowing.
She's a knowing character. I think that's an interesting kind of almost shadow narrative of what's going on with her, because she often has to just sit there and take it and just, not really react to anything. She knows what's going on, though.
Yeah, she does. And because what you say is right, too, because we never know Jane to the extent that we know Emma.
Yeah, we never see inside her
head. Because Jane is always focalised through Emma, isn't she? And Emma misreads her. Emma can't do her justice.
Because she's jealous.
Yeah, jealous as hell. So it's interesting that we never... I find that really interesting. She's a very mysterious
she is mysterious.
Person.
And you're right, we can never kind of approach her at all. Yeah.
I like that.
I like that too. Yeah. Because you can imagine, you can therefore project onto Jane or think about Jane in ways that are kind of interesting and fruitful. Yeah. We are completely run out of time to the point there where I think there are actually people standing outside the studio about to break down the door. But we couldn't help ourselves. It was Emma.
No, it's Jane Austen's
Jane Austen.
fault.
It's Jane Austen's fault. I'm going to blame her. She's been dead for a while. She can take it. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Stephanie. As always, it's a great pleasure.
You're one of my favourite guests.
Oh, good.
If not my favourite. So this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. If you could please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, that would be super helpful. And if you've got any suggestions on future episodes, that would also be great too. We'll see you again in a week, and I'm sure I will bring Emma. I know I almost called you Emma. I will bring Lee back with us again shortly. See you.
Bye.